Veronica, you're such a burden on this family, my Aunt Delilah announced at Christmas dinner, her wineglass raised like she was making some grand toast, while everyone else nodded in agreement around the mahogany table that I had actually paid for. But if that made your blood boil, just wait, because this story is going to absolutely light you up. Don't forget to smash that like button, share this video and hit subscribe, because what happens next? Nobody, and I mean nobody, saw coming. Make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The words hit me like a slap across the face, but I just sat there smiling politely, cutting my turkey while my entire family at our annual Christmas gathering in Willowbrook treated me like I was some charity case. They grudgingly invited out of obligation. My cousin Jasmine, who hadn't held a steady job in 3 years, was going on and on about her new designer handbag that her parents bought her, while my brother Damon showed off his latest gaming setup worth more than most people's monthly rent. And here I was, the so-called family disappointment, listening to them tear me apart, piece by piece. You see, in their eyes, I was the one who never amounted to anything. The college dropout who worked odd jobs and lived paycheck to paycheck, the sister and daughter who couldn't seem to get her life together, no matter how many times they offered their unsolicited advice about what I should be doing with my existence. And tonight at this Christmas dinner in the sprawling colonial house in Willowbrook that had been in our family for generations, they decided to make their feelings crystal clear. I mean, seriously, my mother Evangeline chimed in while adjusting her pearl necklace. We keep hoping you'll finally figure things out, but year after year it's the same story. You're 32 years old. Veronica, when are you going to stop being such a financial drain on everyone? Her voice carried that familiar tone of disappointment, mixed with embarrassment, as if my very presence at the family table was somehow tarnishing their reputation in this upscale neighborhood where appearances meant everything. My father Theodore nodded gravely from the head of the table, his salt and beard making him look distinguished and wise, when really he was just another person who had given up on me years ago. Your Aunt Delilah has a point, sweetheart, he said, using that condescending pet name that made my skin crawl. We've all tried to help you, but you seem determined to make poor choices. Maybe it's time for some tough love. The thing is, they had no idea what my real life looked like, because I had made a conscious decision 3 years ago to keep my mouth shut and my success hidden while they all assumed I was struggling. I was actually building something extraordinary, but they were so busy looking down on me that they never bothered to ask the right questions or pay attention to the subtle signs that their assumptions about me were completely and utterly wrong. Aunt Delilah, who lived in the guest house on the property rent-free, continued her verbal assault. I told Evangeline that maybe we should stop enabling your lifestyle. Veronica, you can't just drift through life expecting everyone else to support you while you figure things out. Some of us have worked hard to build something meaningful. She gestured around the elegant dining room with its crystal chandelier, antique furniture, as if to emphasize how successful the rest of the family was compared to me. My younger sister Penelope, who was fresh out of graduate school and already working at a prestigious law firm in downtown Millfield, couldn't resist adding her 2 cents. I just think Veronica needs to take responsibility for her choices. I mean, we've all managed to create stable careers and contribute to society. Maybe it's time she stopped making excuses and actually did something productive with her life. The irony was so thick you could cut it with a knife, because while they sat there in their expensive clothes, talking about success and contribution and responsibility, not a single one of them knew that the house they were sitting in, the very foundation of their family pride and legacy, was only still standing because of me. But I wasn't ready to reveal that truth yet. I wanted to savor the moment and let them dig their grave just a little bit deeper. You know what bothers me most? Cousin Jasmine added, while taking another sip of the wine that I had secretly paid for through a third party. Is that Veronica acts like she's above all our advice, like she knows something we don't. Look around. She made a sweeping gesture. We're all successful. We all have our lives together. Maybe if she listened to us once in a while, she wouldn't be such a burden. That word again, burden, it seemed to be their favorite way to describe me, as if I was some heavy weight they were forced to carry, some obligation they couldn't shake, and the more they used it, the more I felt that familiar fire building in my chest. The same fire that had driven me to work 18-hour days for the past 3 years, while they all assumed I was lazy and directionless. As I sat there listening to them tear apart everything about my life and my choices, I couldn't help but think about the stack of documents sitting in my safety deposit box at Millfield National Bank. Documents that would change everything they thought they knew about success and failure and who exactly was carrying whom in this family. That revelation would have to wait because this was just the beginning of a very long night. The real question wasn't whether I could handle being called a burden for one more evening. The real question was whether they could handle the truth about who was actually supporting whom and what would happen when the carefully constructed illusion of their family hierarchy came crashing down around them, like a house of cards. But for now I just smiled and took another bite of turkey, waiting for the perfect moment to turn their entire world upside down. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. My name is Veronica Blackthorne, and in my family's eyes, I am the ultimate disappointment, the cautionary tale they whisper about when they think I'm not listening, the daughter who had so much potential, but somehow managed to throw it all away through a series of what they consider catastrophically poor life choices. Growing up in Willowbrook, I was always the odd one out, while my siblings excelled in traditional ways that made my parents beam with pride at country club gatherings and neighborhood barbecues. I was the one asking uncomfortable questions, challenging the status quo, and refusing to follow the predetermined path that had been carefully laid out for me since childhood. When I dropped out of Westfield University in my junior year to pursue what I called alternate opportunities, the disappointment in my father's eyes was unmistakable. My mother Evangeline actually cried for 3 days straight, not because she was worried about my future, but because she was embarrassed about what the neighbors would think when they found out that one of the black children had become a college dropout. Veronica has always been our free spirit, my mother would say to friends and relatives with that forced smile that barely concealed her mortification. She's just taking some time to find herself, which was her polite way of saying that I had become family embarrassment. The black sheep who couldn't seem to get her act together, no matter how many interventions and heart-to-heart conversations they staged. My brother Damon, who graduated summa cum laude from Westfield and immediately landed a 6-figure job at Sterling Financial Group, missed an opportunity to remind everyone about his success, especially when I was around. "Some people are just built for achievement," he would say while adjusting his expensive tie, "and others need more time to figure out their place in the world," his condescending tone making it clear exactly which category he thought I belonged in. Penelope, my younger sister, took a different approach. She genuinely seemed to believe that I was just confused and misguided, rather than fundamentally flawed. "Veronica has always been creative," she would explain to anyone who asked about my situation. "She needs to channel that creativity into something more practical and stable, as if creativity was some kind of character defect that needed to be cured through proper career counseling." The truth was that my family had built their entire identity around traditional markers of success: prestige degrees, corporate jobs, suburban houses, and membership in the right social clubs. They measured worth through paychecks and job titles and social status, which meant that someone like me, who had chosen a completely different path, was incomprehensible to them. After I left university, I worked a series of what they considered dead-end jobs. Waiting tables at Rosewood Cafe downtown, working retail at various shops in the Millfield shopping district, picking up freelance gig work that barely covered my basic expenses. According to my family, I was wasting my intelligence and my potential living teenager who refused to grow up and accept adult responsibilities. What they saw was a 32-year-old woman who still rented a tiny apartment in the less desirable part of Millfield, who drove a 15-year-old Honda Civic that made suspicious noises when starting, who shopped at thrift stores and clipped coupons and seemed to have no ambition beyond surviving from paycheck to paycheck. Aunt Delilah, who had married into money and considered herself an expert on financial success, was particularly vocal about my shortcomings. "I just don't understand how someone with Veronica's back could end up in such a situation," she would say, during family gatherings. "We gave her every advantage, every opportunity, and she chose to throw it all away. For what exactly?" The family narrative about me had become so entrenched over the years that they stopped seeing me as a real person, actual thoughts and feelings and goals. Instead, I had become a symbol of everything they feared about losing control over their carefully constructed lives. I represented the possibility that all their planning and striving and social climbing might not guarantee the outcomes they expected. Family dinners, I would sit quietly and listen to them, discuss their achievements, their latest promotions, their new cars, their vacation plans, their investment strategies, while I picked at my food and offered minimal responses to their half-hearted attempts to include me in conversations that inevitably circled back to my apparent lack of direction. "We just want what's best for you," my father would say whenever the subject of my future came up. "But you have to meet us halfway, Veronica. You have to show us that you're serious about making something of yourself," as if making something of myself meant conforming to their narrow definition of success and abandoning everything that made me who I was. The most painful part wasn't their disappointment, or their lectures, or their barely concealed embarrassment. The most painful part was that they had stopped believing I was capable of surprising them. They had written me off so completely that the possibility of me achieving anything meaningful had become literally unthinkable to them. I had become the family burden, the one they felt obligated to invite to gatherings, but secretly hoped would decline the one they made excuses for. To friends and neighbors, the one whose very existence seemed to challenge their belief that hard work and following the rules would always lead to happiness and prosperity. But what they didn't know, what they couldn't see because they had stopped really looking at me years ago, was that their disappointment had become my greatest motivation. Their low expectations had freed me to pursue something they would never understand, and their complete lack of faith in my abilities had given me the space I needed to build something extraordinary right under their noses. As I sat at that Christmas dinner listening to them call me a burden, I couldn't help but smile because soon, very soon, they were going to discover just how wrong they had been about everything. What my family didn't know was that for the past 3 years, while they assumed I was barely scraping by and drifting through life without purpose, I had been quietly building something that would have blown their minds if they had bothered to pay attention to the subtle clues I had been dropping right in front of them. But they were so convinced of my failure that they missed every single sign. It started innocently enough, small changes that could easily be explained away or overlooked entirely, like when I stopped asking to borrow money for emergencies, which used to happen fairly regularly during my early 20s. My family just assumed I had finally learned to budget better, or maybe found a slightly better paying job at one of my various gigs around Millfield. Then there were the little upgrades that I made to my lifestyle, nothing flashy or obvious but meaningful improvements that should have raised questions if anyone had been paying close attention. Like when I moved from my studio apartment in the rundown East Side district to a 1-bedroom place in Maple Heights, which wasn't exactly luxury living, but it was definitely a step up in terms of safety and neighborhood quality. When my mother asked about the move during a brief phone call, I simply explained that I had found a better deal through a friend who knew someone, which wasn't technically a lie, but it wasn't the whole truth either. The whole truth was that I had specifically chosen that apartment because it was close to several properties I had been watching and researching for months as part of a much larger plan. The new apartment also came with a dedicated office space which I claimed I needed for my freelance projects, and again this wasn't entirely false, but freelance projects was a deliberately vague description that covered a multitude of activities that my family would never have imagined I was capable of pursuing, let alone succeeding. I had always been good with computers and technology growing up, which my family dismissed as just another one of my quirky interests that would never amount to anything practical. They saw it as time wasted on video games and social media rather than developing real skills that could translate into meaningful career opportunities. But during those 2 years after I dropped out of Westfield, I had been teaching myself everything I could about digital marketing, website development, data analysis, and online business strategies. I spent countless hours watching tutorials, reading industry blogs, taking free online courses, and practicing on small projects that gradually became bigger and more sophisticated. The breakthrough came when I helped Rosewood Cafe, where I was waiting tables, create a social media presence that dramatically increased their customer base. Within 6 months, their revenue had doubled, and suddenly other small businesses in the Millfield area were asking me to help them with similar digital transformations. What started as a favor for my boss became a side hustle that quickly grew into something much more substantial. I was charged premium rates for services that local businesses desperately needed, but didn't know how to implement themselves, and the demand was far greater than I had anticipated. Within 18 months, I had built a client roster of over 40 businesses, ranging from restaurants and retail shops, professional services, and small manufacturing companies. My reputation spread through word of mouth, and suddenly I was booked solid for months in advance with a waiting list of potential clients. The beauty of running a digital marketing consultancy was that it required very little overhead, could be operated entirely from my home office, which meant that my profit margins were extraordinarily high. While my family assumed I was still struggling to pay rent, I was actually banking most of my income and reinvesting it strategically. I registered my business as Nexus Digital Solutions, an LLC structure that provided privacy and tax advantages while keeping my name off most public records, which meant that even if my family had been curious enough to do some investigating, they wouldn't have easily discovered the connection between me and this rapidly growing company. The real ginger came when I started expanding beyond simple social media management and website design into comprehensive digital transformation strategies for businesses that were ready to scale up significantly. I wasn't just helping them get more customers, I was helping them completely reimagine their operations for the digital age. One of my biggest early successes was working with Millfield Hardware, a family-owned business that had been struggling to compete with big-box stores. I helped them develop an e-commerce platform that allowed them to serve customers throughout the tri-state region. Their online sales quickly exceeded their in-store revenue by a factor of 3. The owner, Jonathan Millfield, was so impressed with the results that he referred me to other business owners in his network, and suddenly I was working with companies that had multi-million-dollar annual revenues, were willing to pay consultant fees that would have shocked my family if they had known. But the most significant development was when I started investing in real estate, using the substantial income I was generating from my consulting work. I had been studying the Willowbrook market carefully and noticed several properties that were undervalued due to various circumstances that created opportunities for someone with cash and patience. My first investment was a small commercial building in downtown Millfield that was being sold by a family who needed to liquidate quickly due to estate issues. I purchased it for significantly below market value, renovated it using my network of contractor contacts, and then leased it to 3 different businesses at rates that provided excellent returns. The success of that first investment gave me the confidence and capital to pursue larger opportunities, and I began acquiring residential properties in strategic locations throughout Willowbrook and the surrounding communities, always paying cash, always closing quickly, and always maintaining complete privacy about my growing portfolio. What made this particularly satisfying was that I was operating right under my family's noses, in their own neighborhood, making deals and building wealth, while they continued to see me as their disappointing relative who couldn't get her life together. The cognitive dissonance was almost amusing. I had developed relationships with every major real estate agent in the area, several mortgage brokers who specialized in investment properties, and a network of contractors, electricians, plumbers, and other professionals who could handle any renovation or maintenance issues that arose. My business cards simply said, V. Blackthorne, Strategic Consulting, which was vague enough to avoid drawing attention, but professional enough to be taken seriously. In business contexts, I had learned that sometimes the most powerful position is the one where nobody expects you to have any power at all. The financial growth had been exponential by the end of year 2, generating more monthly income than my brother made in his prestigious corporate job, and by year 3 I was earning more than my parents' combined annual salaries, but they had no idea because I had deliberately maintained the appearance of struggling financially. I continued driving my old Honda Civic, shopping at thrift stores, and living modestly, not because I had to anymore but because it served my purposes to let my family maintain their illusions about my situation, while I quietly built something that would eventually change everything they thought they knew about success. Failure, big. The worst part about sitting at that Christmas dinner table wasn't just being called a burden. It was listening to my family systematically tear apart every aspect of my life, with the kind of casual cruelty that comes from years of practice and the absolute certainty that they knew everything there was to know about my situation, when in reality they knew absolutely nothing at all. Aunt Delilah, who had clearly been waiting for this moment all evening, set down her wineglass with dramatic flair and launched into what could only be described as a comprehensive character assassination, disguised as family concern. "I've been thinking about this for months," she announced to the table as if she was about to deliver some profound wisdom, "and I really believe that Veronica's problems stem from a fundamental lack of responsibility and accountability." She paused for effect while everyone nodded sagely, as if she had just diagnosed some rare psychological condition, rather than simply restating their long-held prejudices about my character. When I was her age, I was already married with 2 children and helping Richard build his accounting practice, but Veronica seems content to drift through life without any real commitments or goals. My cousin Jasmine, who was 3 years younger than me, but acted like she was decades wiser, jumped in with her own analysis. "I think the real issue is that Veronica has never learned to delay gratification. Wants everything to be easy and fun instead of doing the hard work that success requires, like the rest of us have done." The irony was so thick, I could practically taste it, considering that Jasmine had never held a job for more than 6 months in her entire adult life, and was currently living rent-free in her parents' guest house while pursuing what she called her influencer career, which consisted mainly of posting selfies and complaining about how hard it was to build a social media following. "Remember when she quit that perfectly good job at Morrison Marketing last year?" chimed in with that particular tone of disappointment that she had perfected over the years. "We all tried to tell her that you have to start somewhere and work your way up, but she claimed the corporate environment wasn't right for her, as if any of us love going to work every day." What they didn't know was that I had quit Morrison Marketing because I was already earning twice their salary from my consulting business, and sitting in meetings about outdated marketing strategies felt like a massive waste of time when I had clients paying premium rates for cutting-edge digital solutions actually worked. My father cleared his throat in that authoritative way he used when he wanted everyone to pay attention to his pronouncements. "The problem with your generation, Veronica, is that you think you're entitled to have passion and purpose in your work, when the reality is that most of us just need to find something stable and stick with it whether we love it or not." He gestured around the dining room with obvious pride. "This house, these furnishings, the lifestyle we've built, none of it came from chasing dreams or trying to find ourselves. It came from making practical decisions, following through on commitments, even when it wasn't exciting or glamorous." The beautiful mahogany table, he was gesturing toward the crystal chandelier overhead, the Persian rugs, the antique furniture that he was using as evidence of his superior life choices, All of it was about to become very relevant to our conversation, in ways that none of them could possibly imagine. Brother Damon, who had been relatively quiet up to this point, suddenly found his voice and decided to share some brotherly wisdom. I've been talking to some people at Sterling Financial about entry-level positions. Think I could probably get you an interview if you're serious about finally getting your life on track. He said this with the kind of magnanimous generosity that people use when they think they're offering charity to someone desperate enough to accept anything. It wouldn't be glamorous work, organizing data entry, that sort of thing, but it would be a real job with benefits and a clear path for advancement if you proved yourself. The condescension in his voice was matched only by the complete obliviousness to the fact that I was already running a business that generated more revenue in a single month than his annual salary, but I just smiled and nodded as if I was grateful for his consideration. Penelope decided to approach the situation from what she probably thought was a more supportive angle. I really think Veronica just needs some structure and mentorship. Maybe if she took some business classes at Millfield Community College, or got involved with one of those entrepreneurship programs for women, she could learn some practical skills. Her suggestion that I needed to learn entrepreneurship from a community college program while I was already successfully running a multi-six-figure consulting business and real estate investment portfolio was particularly amusing, but I maintained my expression of polite interest. The thing is, Aunt Delilah continued warming to her theme, enabling this behavior by continuing to include Veronica in family gatherings, pretending like her lifestyle choices are acceptable. Isn't helping anyone. We need to have some tough conversations about expectations and consequences. She looked around the table for support and found plenty of nodding heads. I mean, when was the last time she contributed anything meaningful? This family, when was the last time she brought a successful boyfriend to introduce? When was the last time she achieved anything that we could actually be proud of? My mother sighed heavily as if the burden of having such a disappointing daughter was almost too much to bear. I keep hoping that one day she'll wake up and realize that she's wasting her potential, but every year it gets worse instead of better. And I'm starting to worry that we're enabling her by not being more direct about our concerns. The conversation continued in this vein for what felt like hours, with each family member taking turns to dissect my failures, analyze my character flaws, and propose solutions for my apparently hopeless situation. They spoke about me as if I wasn't sitting right there, as if I was some kind of case study rather than a human being, with feelings and thoughts and actual accomplishments. Made it even more surreal was that they were having this conversation in a house that I now owned, sitting around a table that I had paid for, eating food that I had subsidized through financial arrangements they knew nothing about, while planning my financial future using investment strategies that I had taught myself. The level of disconnect between their perception of reality and the actual facts of the situation was almost breathtaking in its completeness. They had constructed such an elaborate narrative about my failures that they were completely blind to any evidence that might contradict their assumptions. As they continued their character assassination disguised as family intervention, I found myself thinking about the safety deposit box at Millfield National Bank, and all those documents that would soon turn their entire understanding of our family dynamics upside down. But for now, I just sat there listening to them explain everything that was wrong with me, and everything I needed to change about my life, while secretly planning the moment when I would reveal just how spectacularly wrong they had been about absolutely everything. The moment that finally pushed me over the edge came when my father stood up from his chair at the head of the table and delivered what he clearly thought was going to be some kind of definitive intervention that would finally shake me out of my supposed delusions and force me to confront the harsh realities of adult life. "Veronica," I said in that slow, deliberate tone he used when he wanted to make sure everyone understood the gravity of his words. "Your mother and I have been discussing your situation extensively over the past few months, and we've come to some difficult but necessary conclusions about how this family needs to move forward. The room fell silent except for the soft ticking of the antique grandfather clock in the corner, the same clock that had belonged to my great-grandmother and had been in this house for over 60 years, watching over generations of family gatherings and witnessing countless moments of triumph and disappointment. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper which he placed on the table in front of him with ceremonial precision. We've prepared what you might call a family improvement plan with specific goals and deadlines that we think will help you get back on track. My stomach twisted as I realized they had actually taken the time to write down their expectations for my life, as if I was some kind of troubled teenager who needed structure and accountability rather than a grown woman who had been successfully managing her own affairs for years. First, he continued reading from his prepared statement. You need to find stable full-time employment within the next 60 days, preferably in an office environment where you can learn professional skills and demonstrate reliability. Damon has already spoken to his contacts at Sterling Financial and they're willing to interview you for a data entry position. The condescension was breathtaking. They had reduced my entire future to a data entry job at my brother's company, as if that represented some kind of generous opportunity rather than a massive step backward from everything I had already achieved. Second, you need to develop a realistic budget and start paying back the money this family has invested in your education and various failed ventures over the years. We calculate that between college tuition, living expenses, and emergency loans, you owe approximately $47,000. My mouth fell open because I had never asked for any loans in recent years, and the college tuition they were referring to was something they had offered to pay as a gift when I started at Westfield University. But apparently they had been keeping a running tally of every dollar they had ever spent on me, as if my existence was some kind of business transaction. Third, you need to move back into this house temporarily while you get your finances in order. We've prepared the small bedroom upstairs and you can stay here rent-free for 6 months while you prove that you're serious about making changes. The small bedroom upstairs was barely larger than a closet and had been used for storage for the past decade. But apparently they thought offering me cramped quarters in my childhood home was some kind of generous gesture rather than a humiliating step backward. Fourth, you need to end any romantic relationships that aren't leading toward marriage with someone who has stable employment and long-term potential. We're not getting any younger and we'd like to see you settled with a family before it's too late. This was particularly absurd since I hadn't brought anyone to family gatherings in over 2 years. Not because I was having trouble with relationships, but because I had learned that introducing anyone to my family inevitably led to embarrassing interrogations about their income and career prospects. And finally, you need to commit to attending monthly family meetings where we can review your progress and provide guidance on important decisions. We think regular check-ins will help keep you accountable and prevent you from making impulsive choices that could derail your progress. He folded the paper and looked at me expectantly, as if he had just presented some kind of reasonable proposal rather than a comprehensive plan to micromanage every aspect of my adult life, based on completely false assumptions about my circumstances. The silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity while everyone waited for my response, and I felt something fundamental shift inside me, like a dam finally giving way after years of pressure building behind it. So let me make sure I understand this correctly, I said slowly, keeping my voice calm and level despite the fury building in my chest. You want me to quit whatever I'm doing now, a data entry job at Damon's company, move back into my childhood bedroom, pay you back for money I never borrowed, and submit to monthly performance reviews like I'm some kind of employee, rather than your daughter? My father nodded gravely. We know it sounds harsh, but sometimes tough love is the only way to help someone who's been making poor choices for so long. We're not doing this to punish you. We're doing this because we love you and we want to see you succeed. That phrase, tough love, had always been their favorite justification for treating me like a problem that needed to be solved, rather than a person who deserved respect and consideration. And if I don't agree to these terms, I continued, what exactly happens then? Aunt Delilah leaned forward with obvious satisfaction. Then we stop enabling your lifestyle choices. You're no longer welcome at family gatherings, you can't expect any financial support during emergencies, and you'll need to figure out your life without any help from us." She said this as if cutting me off from the family was some kind of devastating threat rather than something that might actually be a relief considering how they treated me. "Hoping it won't come to that," my mother added with crocodile tears forming in her eyes, "but we can't continue watching you waste your life when we know you're capable of so much more than this." The beautiful irony was that they were threatening to disown me for not living up to their expectations, while I was already more successful than any of them could imagine, and the house they were threatening to ban me from was actually mine. My brother Damon cleared his throat awkwardly. "Look, Veronica, I know this is a lot to process, but we're all on the same team here. We want what's best for you. Sometimes that means making difficult changes." His patronizing tone was the final straw, because here was my little brother who had never taken a risk or built anything meaningful trying to lecture me about success while offering me a pity job at his corporate employer. As I looked around the table at their expectant faces, their obvious satisfaction at finally cornering me, their complete certainty that they held all the cards in this situation, I felt something cold and calculating settle into place where the hurt and anger had been. They had just given me the perfect opening to reveal everything they didn't know about my life and their own precarious position in ways that would shock them to their core. "That's a very interesting proposal," I said with a smile that didn't reach my eyes, "but before I give you my answer, I think there are a few things about my situation you should probably know." The energy in the room shifted immediately as my words hung in the air like a challenge that nobody quite knew how to interpret. My family exchanged glances that ranged from confused to skeptical to slightly annoyed, as if I was about to launch into another one of my supposedly delusional explanations for why their perfectly reasonable intervention wasn't necessary. "Oh please, Veronica," Aunt Delilah said with an exaggerated eye roll. "We've heard all your excuses before about how you're doing better than it looks or how you have some master plan that we just don't understand, but the numbers don't lie. And your lifestyle speaks for itself." She gestured dismissively toward my thrift store sweater and worn jeans, as if my clothing choices were irrefutable evidence of my financial situation completely missing. The irony that I could afford to dress however I wanted but chose comfort and practicality over designer labels that impressed shallow relatives. My father held up his hand to silence any further commentary, clearly wanting to maintain control over what he saw as a crucial family intervention. "Now Veronica, I know you're probably feeling defensive right now, but before you start making excuses or trying to deflect, I want you to really think about whether you're being honest with yourself about your circumstances." His patronizing tone made my skin crawl, but I forced myself to remain calm and composed because rushing into my revelation robbed it of the maximum impact. I wanted every word, every pause, every carefully timed disclosure to hit them like a sledgehammer. "I'm not making excuses, Dad," I replied quietly, standing up from my chair and walking over to the antique sideboard where my mother kept the good china and crystal that only came out for special occasions. "I'm just saying that there might be some gaps in your understanding of my actual situation." I opened the top drawer and pulled out a small leather portfolio that I had discreetly placed there earlier when I arrived for dinner, knowing that this moment would eventually come and wanting to have everything I needed within easy reach. "What's in the folder, Veronica?" my brother asked with barely concealed impatience. "More business cards for your freelance photography hobby, or maybe some inspirational quotes about following your dreams?" His sarcastic tone revealed just how little he thought of any venture I might be involved in, which made what I was about to show them even more satisfying. "Actually, Damon, it's something much more interesting than that," I said, returning to my seat and placing the portfolio on the table in front of me, but not opening it yet. "It's documentation of some investments and business arrangements that I've been working on over the past few years." My mother leaned forward with the kind of forced patience that parents use when they're humoring a child's fantasy. "Sweetheart, we know you've been trying different things. We appreciate your ambition, but maybe this isn't the best time to discuss your creative projects. We're trying to have a serious conversation about your future."
The condescension was breathtaking. They were so convinced that anything I had to show them would be amateur and insignificant, that I couldn't even conceive of the possibility that I might have accomplished something meaningful. Oh, but Mom, this is very much related to my future, and actually to all of our futures in ways that might surprise you, I said with a smile that was starting to make some of them look slightly uncomfortable. In fact, some of these documents directly relate to this house and this family in ways that you definitely need to understand. Cousin Jasmine rolled her eyes dramatically. Here we go with the mysterious hints and cryptic statements. Veronica, if you have something to say, just say it instead of being all dramatic about it. Her dismissive attitude was exactly what I had been counting on, because the more skeptical and condescending they were now, the more shocking my revelation would be when I finally delivered it. You're absolutely right, Jasmine, I agreed, opening the portfolio and carefully removing several official-looking documents. Let me be very direct and specific about what I want to share with all of you. I spread the first set of papers across the table, making sure everyone could see the official letterheads and legal seals that marked them as serious biz documents rather than the amateur efforts they were clearly expecting. These are incorporation papers for Nexus Digital Solutions LLC, which is a consulting company that I founded and have been operating successfully for the past 3 years. I announced, watching their faces carefully for sign that the information was sinking in. My father picked up one of the documents and examined it with the skeptical expression of someone looking for evidence of forgery or some other kind of deception. This looks official enough, but starting a small business doesn't necessarily mean anything about profitability or long-term viability. His automatic assumption that my business must be small and unprofitable revealed just how deeply ingrained their low expectations had become. You're absolutely right to be cautious about jumping to conclusions, Dad, I agreed, pulling out another set of documents, which is why I brought the tax returns and financial statements that show exactly how profitable this small business has been. The room fell silent as I placed the documents on the table where everyone could see the revenue figures that were clearly visible at the top of each page. Numbers that were significantly larger than anyone had expected. Penelope grabbed one of the tax returns and stared at it in confusion. Wait, these numbers can't be right. This says your gross income last year was over $800,000, but that's impossible. Her voice trailed off as she double-checked the figures, clearly unable to reconcile what she was seeing with everything she thought she knew about my financial situation. The numbers are completely accurate, I confirmed calmly. And those figures represent only the consulting business. They don't include income from my real estate investments, which have been performing quite well over the same time period.
Aunt Delilah snatched another document from the table and studied it with growing alarm. Real estate investments. What real estate investments? How could you possibly afford real estate when you're supposedly living paycheck to paycheck? Her voice was rising with each word as the carefully constructed narrative about my failures began to crumble in the face of concrete evidence that contradicted everything they had assumed. Well, that's actually a very good question, I said, reaching for another folder that I had brought with me. And the answer is going to be particularly interesting to everyone at this table, because some of these investments involve properties that are very familiar to all of you. My brother leaned back in his chair, looking genuinely shaken. Veronica, what exactly are you trying to tell us here? Because this is starting to sound like you're claiming to be some kind of secret millionaire, which is obviously ridiculous. The doubt in his voice was understandable given how carefully I had maintained the appearance of financial struggle, but it was also exactly the kind of skepticism that would make my final revelation even more devastating. I'm not claiming, Damon, I replied, pulling out the last set of documents from my portfolio. I'm simply showing you factual information about my business activities and investment portfolio, but you're right that we haven't gotten to the most interesting part yet. I held up a thick document with officials and signatures that immediately caught everyone's attention, because even from a distance they could see that it was some kind of legal paperwork with serious implications. This particular document is going to be especially relevant to tonight's conversation about my future lit arrangements, and my need to contribute more to this family because it directly addresses the question of who exactly owns what in terms of our family assets. The silence that followed was deafening, as everyone stared at the document in my hands trying to process what I might be about to reveal, while their entire understanding of our family dynamics hung in the balance. I unfolded the document slowly, savoring every second of the anticipation that was building around the table, as my family leaned forward, trying to read the legal text that would fundamentally change everything they thought they knew about power, and ownership and financial security in our family. "This is a deed of ownership," I announced clearly, watching their faces as the words registered. "Specifically, it's the deed to this house. The house we're sitting in right now, the house where you just offered to let me stay in the spare bedroom as some kind of generous charity." The blood drained from my father's face so quickly I thought he might faint, while my mother's hand flew to her throat in that instinctive gesture people make when they're struggling to breathe properly. "That's impossible," whispered, his voice barely audible above the sudden ringing silence that had descended over the dining room. "This house has been in our family for generations. My grandfather bought it in 1962 and left it to my father, who left it to me. There's no way you could own it." I placed the deed on the table where everyone could see the official county seal and the signatures that made it legally binding and irrefutable. "You're absolutely right about the family history, Dad. But what you don't know is that 3 months ago, when you were facing foreclosure proceedings because of the second mortgage took out to pay for Damon's MBA and Penelope's law school tuition, I purchased this property through a private sale to prevent it from going to auction." The silence that followed was so complete that I could hear the individual tick of each second on the grandfather clock in the corner marking time, while my family's entire understanding of their financial situation crumbled around them. My brother Damon was the first to find his voice, though it came out as more of a croak than actual speech. "Foreclosure proceedings. What foreclosure proceedings? We would have known if the house was in danger." He looked desperately at our father for confirmation, but Dad was staring at the deed with the expression of someone who had just watched their entire world collapse in real time. "Your parents didn't tell you about the financial difficulties they were having," I explained gently. "They were trying to protect your image of family stability, but the truth is that supporting your education and maintaining this lifestyle had put them in serious debt." I pulled out another document from my portfolio, a folder thick with bank statements and loan agreements. The second mortgage they had a variable interest rate that increased dramatically over the past 2 years, and between the monthly payments and the maintenance costs on this old house, they were falling behind by almost $3,000 every month. My mother finally found her voice, though it sounded hollow and defeated. "How could you possibly know about our private financial matters? Veronica, we never discussed any of this with you." The hurt in her voice was genuine, but it was also revealing because it showed that even now, facing concrete evidence of my knowledge and resources, she still couldn't conceive of me as someone capable of sophisticated financial awareness. "I know because when properties in Willowbrook go into pre-foreclosure proceedings, it becomes public record, and since I've been investing in real estate in this area for the past 3 years, I monitor all the filings very carefully," I explained. "When I saw this address on the list, I made some inquiries and discovered the full extent of the situation." Aunt Delilah, who had been uncharacteristically quiet, suddenly exploded with indignation. "So you're telling us that instead of offering to help your own parents when they were struggling, you decided to swoop in and buy their house out from under them like some kind of vulture capitalist?" Her accusation was exactly what I had expected, because people like her always assume the worst possible motives when they're confronted with evidence that contradicts their prejudices. "Actually, Delilah, I did offer to help," I replied calmly, "but when I approached Dad about providing financial assistance, he told me that he didn't need charity from his unemployed daughter and that I should focus on getting my own life together before worrying about other people's problems." My father's face went from pale to bright red as he remembered that conversation, which had taken place just 4 months earlier, when I had tried to find a diplomatic way to offer support without revealing the full extent of my financial capabilities. "You never said you had the kind of money that could solve our problems. he protested weakly. You made it sound like you were offering to help us apply for assistance programs, or something like that. The desperation in his voice was heartbreaking because he was grasping for any explanation that would allow him to maintain some dignity in this situation. I was being subtle because I didn't want to embarrass you, I admitted, but when you made it clear that you would rather lose the house than accept help from me, I realized that the only way to save the family home was to do it quietly and let you maintain your pride. Penelope picked up the deed and examined it with her lawyer's training, looking for any loophole or technicality that might invalidate what she was seeing. This appears to be legitimate, but I don't understand the financial mechanics. How did you manage to purchase a property worth over $1 million, when according to your own story you've only been earning significant income for 3 years? Her question revealed that she was still trying to find rational explanations for something that didn't fit her understanding of how the world worked. The purchase price was actually much lower than the assessed value because it was a distressed sale, I explained. Your parents owed $1.4 million on the second mortgage and were facing immediate foreclosure, so I was able to negotiate a purchase price of $1.6 million, which gave them enough to pay off their debts, have a small amount left over. I pulled out the final document that I had been saving for this moment. This is the rental agreement that your parents signed when they sold me the house. It allows them to continue living here for the next 5 years at a monthly rent of $1, which I thought was a fair arrangement given the circumstances. The $1 rent detail hit them like a physical blow because it made clear that I had structured the entire transaction to preserve their dignity while also protecting the family home from being lost to strangers. My mother was crying now, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming realization that everything she thought she knew about her daughter and her family's financial situation had been completely wrong. So when you offered me the spare bedroom tonight, I said with a slight smile, you were essentially offering to let me stay in my own house, which I found somewhat amusing given the circumstances. The power dynamic in the room had shifted so completely that nobody seemed to know how to respond or what to say next. Brother Damon cleared his throat nervously. So what happens now, Veronica? Are you going to evict us? Going to raise the rent? Are you going to hold this over our heads forever? His questions revealed that he still didn't understand that I had never intended to use this information as a weapon against them. What happens now, I said, standing up and beginning to gather my documents, is that you all need to decide whether you want to continue treating me like a burden and a failure, or whether you're ready to have an honest conversation about what family support actually looks like. The room remained silent, as they processed not just the financial implications of what I had revealed, but the deeper questions about respect and judgment, and the assumptions they had been making about success and failure. Because if you're still convinced that I need to take a data entry job and move back into the spare bedroom, I continued, then we probably don't have much more to discuss tonight. The stunned silence that followed my challenge stretched on for nearly a full minute, before my father finally managed to speak, his voice hoarse with shock and what might have been the first stirrings of genuine humility I had ever heard from him. Veronica, I don't understand how any of this is possible, he said slowly, as if speaking the words carefully might somehow make them make more sense. Even if you've been successful with your business, how could you have accumulated enough capital to purchase a multi-million-dollar property while maintaining the appearance of financial struggle? His question revealed that even confronted with irrefutable documentation, he was still struggling to reconcile the evidence with his fundamental assumptions about my capabilities and financial acumen. That's actually an excellent question, Dad, and the answer is going to give you an even better understanding of exactly how wrong your assessment of my situation has been, I replied, reaching for another folder that I had kept separate from the initial documents. I opened it to reveal a thick stack of property deeds and investment statements that represented just a fraction of my actual portfolio, but enough to demonstrate the scope of what I had been building while they dismissed me as a failure. This house isn't the only real estate I own in Willowbrook.
I announced, placing the documents on the table where everyone could see the official seals and legal stamps marked them as authentic. Over the past 3 years, I've acquired 14 properties in this area, including 6 single-family homes, 4 apartment buildings, 2 commercial spaces, and a small office complex. My brother Damon grabbed one of the deeds and stared at the address with growing recognition. Wait. This is the Morrison building downtown where I go to that coffee shop on the first floor. You own that entire building. His voice carried a note of disbelief as he realized that he had been frequenting a business located in a building owned by the sister he had been pitying for lack of professional success. I do indeed own the Morrison building, I confirmed, and coincidentally the coffee shop you're referring to is one of my consulting clients. I helped them develop their digital marketing strategy, which increased their revenue by over 200% in the first year. Cousin Jasmine snatched another deed from the pile and her face went white as she read the address. This can't be right. This says you own the Maple Street apartments. But that's where my friend Rachel lives and she's always complaining about how expensive the rent is. The irony was delicious, because Jasmine had spent countless family gatherings telling stories about Rachel's struggles with housing costs, never realizing that the landlord collecting those rental payments was sitting right across the table from her. The Maple Street property has been one of my most profitable investments, I explained. I purchased it when it was in serious disrepair, renovated all 8 units with high-end finishes and appliances, and now it commands premium rental rates because of the quality and location. My mother picked up a commercial property deed with trembling hands. Riverside Shopping Plaza. You own the entire shopping center where I get my hair done and buy groceries. Her voice was barely above a whisper as she realized that virtually every aspect of their daily lives in Willowbrook somehow connected to my business empire. I acquired the shopping plaza 18 months ago when the previous owner was facing bankruptcy, I said. It required significant capital investment to update the infrastructure and attract quality tenants, but it's now fully occupied with a waiting list of businesses that want to lease space there. Aunt Delilah, who had been unusually quiet while examining the documents, suddenly looked up with an expression of dawning horror. Veronica, how much are all these properties worth combined? Because if these addresses are accurate, you own a significant portion of the most valuable real estate in this entire area. Her question hit at the heart of what was really bothering all of them, which wasn't just that I was successful, but that I was successful on a scale that dwarfed their own achievements and made their condescending advice look absurd in retrospect. The current assessed value of my real estate portfolio, approximately $12.7 million. I replied, watching their faces carefully as the number sank in. But that doesn't include the value of my consulting business, which has been valued at just over $4 million by an independent accounting firm. The silence that followed, different from the earlier shocked quiet, this was the silence of people trying to process information that fundamentally challenged everything they thought they knew about success, wealth, and family dynamics. Penelope, who had been frantically calculating numbers on her phone, looked up with obvious stress. Veronica, that means you have a net worth of over $15 million, which makes you wealthier than everyone else in this family combined. Her legal training had allowed her to quickly grasp the financial implications, but her tone suggested that she was struggling with the emotional impact of discovering that her supposedly failed older sister was actually the most successful person she knew. The exact numbers fluctuate based on market conditions and business performance, I said. But yes, your calculation is essentially correct. I have been quietly building wealth at a pace that has exceeded my own expectations. My father slumped back in his chair, looking like he had aged 10 years in the past hour. I don't understand why you would hide all of this from us. Why you would let us think you were struggling when you could have been helping us understand what real success looks like. His confusion was genuine, but it also revealed that he still didn't grasp the fundamental issue, which wasn't about hiding success, but about earning respect. I didn't hide my success to deceive you, Dad. I explained patiently. I maintained privacy about my financial situation because I wanted to see whether this family could respect and support me based on who I am as a person, rather than what I own or how much money I make. Brother Damon shook his head in apparent frustration. But Veronica, if you had told us about your business success, we would have been proud of you, have celebrated your achievements instead of worrying about your future. His protest revealed exactly the kind of superficial thinking that had motivated my decision to keep my wealth private. Would you really have been proud, Damon? I asked, or would you have simply been impressed by the money while still dismissing the unconventional path I took to earn it? Remember that even tonight when I started showing you documentation of my success, your first instinct was to assume it couldn't be real. The truth of that observation hung in the air, because every single person at the table initially reacted to my revelations with skepticism and disbelief rather than curiosity or congratulations. But the bigger question, I continued, is whether you can understand why someone might want to be valued for their character and judgment and contributions rather than just their bank account balance. Aunt Delilah, who had been studying the property documents with obvious distress, finally spoke up. Veronica, this is all very impressive, but it doesn't change the fact that you deceived us for years, letting us worry about you and offer advice when you knew perfectly well that you didn't need any help. Her attempt to maintain moral superiority even in the face of overwhelming evidence that she had been completely wrong about everything was almost admirable in its stubborn consistency. You're absolutely right that I could have corrected your misconceptions about my financial situation, I acknowledged, but I wanted to see what kind of support this family would offer someone they believed was struggling, and frankly the results have been quite revealing. The aftermath of my revelations created a psychological whiplash that left my family members struggling to process not just the factual information I had presented, but the complete inversion of everything they thought they knew about power dynamics and success within our family structure. My mother was the first to attempt some kind of response, but her words came out fragmented and confused as she tried to reconcile years of worry and disappointment with the reality that her supposedly struggling daughter had been quietly building a business empire. I just don't understand how we could have been so wrong about everything, she said, her voice trembling with what might have been shame, confusion, or possibly anger. We've spent years trying to help you get your life together, and all this time, you were more successful than any of us could have imagined. Her statement revealed the depth of their collective delusion, because they had never actually tried to help me get my life together. They had simply assumed it needed getting together, and proceeded to offer unwanted advice based on false premises. Brother Damon seemed to be experiencing a different kind of crisis as he stared at the property documents spread across the table. I need to understand the timeline here, Veronica, because some of this doesn't add up. If you've been this successful for years, why did you let me offer you a job at Sterling Financial just 20 minutes ago? His question carried an undertone of humiliation, because he was beginning to realize that his generous offer of an entry-level position had been inadvertently insulting to someone who was already more financially successful than anyone else in the family. I let you make the offer because I was curious to see how far this intervention would go, I replied honestly, and because I wanted everyone at this table to fully commit to their assumptions about my life before I revealed how wrong those assumptions were. The strategic nature of my approach was clearly unsettling to them, because it suggested that I had been several steps ahead of their thinking throughout the entire evening. Penelope, who had frantically taking notes on her phone, looked up with obvious distress. Veronica, this means that when I suggested you take entrepreneurship classes at the community college, I was essentially telling someone who owns a multi-million-dollar business empire to go learn basic business skills. Part-time instructors. Her legal training had helped her quickly identify the most embarrassing aspects of their collective behavior, and she seemed genuinely mortified by the implications. Your suggestion was well-intentioned, I said diplomatically, but it did highlight how little attention the family pays to my actual activities and interests versus how much energy you invest in trying to fix problems that don't exist. Aunt Delilah, who had been uncharacteristically quiet while processing the magnitude of her misjudgment, suddenly erupted with defensive anger. This is all very impressive, Veronica, but you still deceived us for years, and that deception has consequences. You can't just reveal that you're wealthy and expect us to forget about the lies and manipulation. Her attempt to reframe my privacy as deception was predictable because people like her always need to find ways to avoid acknowledging that they were completely wrong about something important. I never lied to anyone about anything, I replied calmly. When you asked about my work, I told you I was doing consulting and digital marketing. When you asked about my living situation, I explained that I had found a better apartment through connections. When you offered unsolicited advice about my finances, I politely thanked you for your concern.
The distinction between privacy and deception was clearly lost on her because she needed to believe that my behavior had been somehow dishonest in order to maintain her sense of moral superiority. My father, who had been silent for several minutes, finally spoke up with a voice that sounded hollow. And defeated the thing that bothers me most is that we failed you as a family not because we didn't support your success, but because we never bothered to really understand what you were doing or who you had become. His admission was more honest and self-aware than I had expected, and it suggested that at least some members of my family might be capable of genuine reflection about their behavior. But I also don't understand why you would put yourself through years of condescension and criticism when you could have easily proven us wrong at any time. He continued, why subject yourself to that kind of treatment when you had the power to stop it? His question touched on something that I had been thinking about for months as I watched my family's behavior become increasingly dismissive and condescending. Because I wanted to see who you all really were when you thought you had nothing to gain from treating me well, I explained. I wanted to understand whether this family's love and support was conditional on my financial success, or whether it was based on something deeper. The silence that followed was heavy with the implications of what I had discovered through my experiment in remaining invisible. Cousin Jasmine, who had been unusually quiet since discovering that her friend was paying rent to me, suddenly found her voice. So this was all some kind of test that we apparently failed because we didn't magically intuit that you were secretly wealthy. Defensive tone revealed that she was struggling to process the idea that their treatment of me might have been unfair or unkind. It wasn't a test with right or wrong answers, I clarified. It was an opportunity for this family to demonstrate what kind of support they offer to someone they believe is struggling, and the results speak for themselves. Brother Damon shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Look, Veronica, I understand that our advice might have seemed condescending in retrospect, but we genuinely thought we were trying to help someone who was having trouble finding direction. Attempt to justify their behavior as helpful rather than judgmental showed that he still didn't grasp the fundamental issue. The problem wasn't that you offered advice, I said patiently. The problem was that you never asked questions, you never showed curiosity about my actual life or interests, goals. You simply assumed that because my path didn't look like yours, it must be wrong. My mother wiped tears from her eyes and looked at me with what might have been genuine remorse. We should have been more supportive. We should have trusted that you knew what you were doing, even if we didn't understand it. Her acknowledgement was more than I had expected, but it also highlighted how deeply their prejudices had affected their ability to see me clearly. The question now, I continued, is whether anything changes going forward, or whether this revelation just becomes another family story that we tell ourselves to avoid dealing with deeper issues about respect and judgment. Aunt Delilah, who had been growing increasingly agitated throughout the conversation, finally exploded. I refuse to sit here and be lectured about family values by someone who deliberately manipulated us for years. You may have more money than the rest of us, but that doesn't give you the right to judge our behavior. Her outburst revealed that she was completely unwilling to examine her own assumptions or behavior, even when confronted with overwhelming evidence that she had been wrong. "I'm not judging anyone's behavior," I replied quietly. "I'm simply pointing out that the way this family treats people who they believe are unsuccessful says something important about your values and priorities." The room fell silent again as everyone contemplated the uncomfortable truth that their treatment of me had revealed aspects of their character that they probably didn't want to acknowledge. "So where do we go from here?" my father asked finally, because I have a feeling that this conversation is far from over. The week following that explosive Christmas dinner passed in an eerie silence that felt more unsettling than the actual confrontation had been. Nobody called, nobody texted, and when I drove past my parents' house on the way to a client meeting, I noticed that the lights seemed to be on at unusual hours, as if they were having trouble sleeping. I had expected some kind of response to my revelations, whether positive or negative, but the complete radio silence suggested that my family was engaged in some kind of collective processing that might be leading them in directions I hadn't anticipated. The first sign that things were taking an unexpected turn came exactly 8 days after Christmas, when I received a certified letter at my office address, which immediately raised red flags because very few people knew about my business location, and even fewer would have reason to send legal correspondence there. The return address showed the law firm of Whitmore Sterling Associates, which I recognized as one of the most expensive litigation firms in the greater Millfield area, the kind of place that wealthy people went when they wanted to wage serious legal warfare. Inside the envelope was a formal legal document that made my blood run cold as I read the accusation demands that my own family had apparently spent the past week crafting with professional legal assistance. "Notice of intent to contest property transfer and demand for financial disclosure," read the heading, in bold letters followed by several pages of legal language that basically accused me of draughting my parents out of their family home through manipulation and false pretenses. The document alleged that I had taken advantage of my parents' temporary financial difficulties by purchasing their house for below market value, while concealing my true financial resources and ability to provide alternative assistance that would have allowed them to keep the property. According to the legal filing, my failure to disclose my wealth before purchasing the house constituted a form of fraud because my parents would never have agreed to sell if they had known that their daughter had resources to simply pay off their debts without requiring a transfer of ownership. The accusations were technically baseless because I had structured the entire transaction through legitimate legal channels with proper disclosure to all relevant parties, but the fact that my family had chosen to respond to my revelations with a lawsuit, rather than honest conversation, revealed something deeply disturbing about their character. What made the situation even more painful was discovering that the legal action wasn't being pursued by just my parents, but by a coalition that included Aunt Delilah's cousin Jasmine, and even my brother Damon, who had apparently decided that attacking me through the court system was preferable to examining their own behavior. The lawsuit demanded that I provide complete financial disclosure of all my assets and business interest, transfer the house back to my parents for the original mortgage amount, plus interest, and pay additional damages for what they termed emotional distress and family disruption. But the most shocking element was a clause near the end that sought to have me removed as trustee of my great-grandmother's estate, which I had been managing quietly for the past 5 years, and which contained assets that none of them had even known existed. Reading that particular demand made me realize that their legal research had been more thorough than I had given them credit for, and that they were prepared to challenge every aspect of my financial life in order to regain some sense of control over a situation that had left them feeling powerless. I immediately contacted my own attorney, Rebecca Martinez, who specialized in family litigation and real estate disputes, to discuss the implications of what my family was attempting to do. "This is clearly a retaliatory lawsuit filed by people who feel embarrassed and are trying to rewrite history to make themselves feel better," she explained after reviewing the documents. But that doesn't mean we can ignore it because they've made some serious allegations that we need to address properly. She went on to explain that while the accusations were unfounded, the legal process itself could be disruptive and expensive, and that my family's decision to involve high-priced attorneys suggested they were serious about pursuing this course of action, regardless of merits. The real question, Rebecca continued, is whether you want to fight this aggressively or try to resolve it through mediation, because litigation like this can destroy family relationships permanently, even when the person being sued ultimately wins. Her warning about permanent damaged family relationships struck me as almost comically ironic, given that my family had already demonstrated exactly what their relationships were worth when they thought I had nothing to offer them. But the situation became even more complicated when I received a phone call from Jonathan Millfield, hardware store owner, who had been one of my first major consulting clients. "Veronica, I'm really sorry to bother you with this, but I've been getting some strange inquiries about my business relationship with you," he said, sounding genuinely distressed. "Someone claiming to represent your family has been asking questions about your consulting fees and whether I felt like I was overcharged for services." The implication was clear: my family wasn't content to simply challenge the house purchase. They were apparently trying to undermine my business relationships by suggesting that I had overcharging clients or engaging in unethical business practices. They also asked whether I thought it was appropriate for someone to hide their wealth while working with small business owners. Jonathan continued, as if there was something dishonest about not advertising my net worth to every client. His call was followed by similar contacts from 3 other clients over the next 2 days, all reporting that they had been approached by investigators working for my family's legal team and asked leading questions designed to uncover evidence of improper business conduct. The realization that my family was trying to destroy my professional reputation in addition to challenging my property ownership marked a turning point in my thinking about how to respond to their legal assault. What had started as hurt feelings about being called a burden at Christmas dinner had escalated into full-scale war where my own relatives were actively trying to damage my business relationships and financial standing. The most disturbing aspect was that they seemed to believe that my success somehow belonged to them, and that by keeping it private, I had committed some kind of theft that justified their aggressive retaliation. I spent several sleepless nights trying to understand how people who claimed to love me could pivot so quickly from offering unwanted advice to launching coordinated legal and professional attacks designed to undermine everything I had built. The answer came during conversation with my attorney, when she mentioned that one of the lawyers at Whitmore Sterling had let slip that my family believed I owed them compensation for years of emotional support and family investment that had enabled my success. They seemed to think that because they're entitled to share in your wealth regardless of how they treated you. Rebecca explained, and they're framing your privacy about finances as a betrayal that justifies aggressive legal action. The twisted logic was breathtaking, because they were essentially arguing that their years' criticism and condescension had somehow contributed to my success, and that my failure to reward them financially constituted a form of theft. But the final straw came when I discovered that they had contacted my great-grandmother's estate attorney and demanded access to all the financial records related to my management of the trust. Those records would reveal not just the scope of my current wealth but also the strategic planning and investment decisions that had allowed me to grow the estate's value by over 400% during my tenure as trustee. The irony was that my great-grandmother specifically chosen me as trustee because she believed I was the only family member with the intelligence and integrity to manage her assets responsibly. But now my relatives were trying to use that responsibility as another avenue of attack. As I sat in my office reviewing the mounting legal challenges and professional disruptions my family was causing, I realized that their response to learning about my success had revealed something much darker about their character than I had ever imagined possible.
Watching my family try to destroy everything I had built through legal warfare and professional sabotage had initially filled me with hurt and anger, but as the days passed, those emotions crystallized into something much more dangerous, a cold, calculating determination to show them exactly what kind of power they had chosen to challenge. The turning point came during a strategy meeting with my attorney, Rebecca, when she mentioned that my family's legal team had made a critical error in their aggressive approach. They had assumed that my wealth was relatively recent, and therefore vulnerable to challenge, but their investigation was about to uncover just how deep and well-established my financial empire actually was. They've subpoenaed records going back 7 years, Rebecca explained, which means they're about to discover that your business success and real estate investments were just the tip of the iceberg, and that you've been managing family assets, making strategic decisions that affect their financial security in ways they never imagined. Her words reminded me of something I had been trying not to think about during this whole ordeal: the fact that my family's comfortable lifestyle and financial security depended on systems and arrangement with that I had been quietly maintaining behind the scenes for years. It was time to educate them about the true scope of their vulnerability and my control over their financial futures in ways that would make their petty lawsuit look like a child throwing a tantrum. The first step was to call a meeting with Harold Whitmore, the senior partner at their law firm, and someone I had actually done business with on several occasions, though he had no idea about the connection to my family. "Harold, this is Veronica Blackthorne from Nexus Digital Solutions," I said when his secretary put me through. "Understand that your firm is representing some parties in a property dispute that involves me, and I think there are some facts about this situation that you should be aware of before things go any further." The silence on the other end of the line was telling, because Harold was clearly trying to place my name and business in the context of what he knew about the case. "Ms. Blackthorne, I'm not sure it's appropriate for me to discuss an ongoing litigation matter with the opposing party without counsel present," he replied carefully. "I completely understand your position," I said, "but I'm calling to discuss the lawsuit. I'm calling to inform you about some business relationships and financial arrangements that your clients may not have fully disclosed, and that could significantly impact the foundation of their legal claims." I could hear him shuffling papers as he tried to access the case file while we spoke. "For example," I continued, "did your clients mention that their current residence is owned by Blackthorne Properties LLC, and that they are tenants under a lease agreement that contains specific performance clauses and termination conditions?" The pause that followed told me that this information was news to him. "They also may not have mentioned that the trust fund that pays for cousin Jasmine's monthly living expenses is administered by me as trustee, or that the commercial loan that allowed my brother to purchase his Tesla was secured through one of my business entities." Harold's breathing had become noticeably more careful as he began to understand the complexity of the situation. "Mr. Whitmore, I think it would be in everyone's best interest if you advised your clients to reconsider their legal strategy, because they appear to have initiated litigation against someone who holds significant leverage over their financial stability." After hanging up with Harold, I spent the rest of the day implementing a series of strategic moves that would demonstrate to my family exactly what kind of power they had chosen to challenge. First, I called the property management company that handled the Maple Street apartments, where cousin Jasmine's friend Rachel lived, and instructed them to begin the process of converting the building to luxury condominiums, which would require all current tenants to either purchase their units at market rate or relocate within 90 days. Next, I contacted the leasing manager at the Riverside Shopping Plaza and informed them that I would not be renewing the lease for the hair salon where my mother had been getting her weekly appointments for the past 8 years. The salon would need to find a new location or close down. I also reached out to the commercial lender who had financed my brother's car purchase and activated a clause in the loan agreement that allowed for immediate repayment demands If the borrower engaged in activities that could jeopardize their financial stability, filing a frivolous lawsuit against a major creditor certainly qualified, but the most significant move was calling an emergency meeting of the Board of Trustees for my great-grandmother's estate, which controlled assets worth over $23 million, and provided quarterly distributions to various family members who had no idea where their supplemental income actually originated. I need to inform the board that several beneficiaries of this trust have initiated litigation against me personally, I announced during the video conference with the other trustees, and I believe this creates a conflict of interest that requires immediate attention. The 3 independent trustees who served alongside me were obviously concerned about the implications. "What kind of litigation are we talking about, Veronica?" asked Margaret Chen, the retired bank president who chaired the board.
They're alleging fraud and demanding financial disclosure related to a real estate transaction where I purchased property from family members to prevent foreclosure. I explained. But more importantly, they're seeking to have me removed as trustee, which suggests they may be planning to challenge the estate's management decisions. The board voted unanimously to suspend all distributions to the litigating family members, pending resolution of the legal matter, which meant that my parents' aunt, brother, and cousin would stop receiving their monthly checks within 30 days. Next, I activated the most powerful weapon in my arsenal by calling Thomas Sterling, the president of Sterling Financial Group, where my brother worked. "Tom, this is Veronica Blackthorne. We've done business together on several commercial lending deals," I said when he took my call. "Of course, Veronica, what can I do for you?" he replied warmly. "I wanted to give you a heads up that one of your employees, Damon Blackthorne, has filed a lawsuit against me, and some of the allegations involve business practices that could reflect poorly on Sterling's reputation if they become public." Tom's tone immediately became more serious. "What kind of allegations are we talking about?" "Claims of fraud, financial manipulation, and unethical business conduct," I explained, "all of which are baseless, but the litigation could generate negative publicity that mentions Sterling Financial since Damon has been discussing his employment there in connection with the case." I could hear him typing notes as I spoke. "I'm not asking you to take any specific action," I continued, "but I thought you should be aware that one of your employees is involved in a high-profile family dispute that could potentially impact the firm's reputation." The final piece of my response strategy involved reaching out to Jonathan Millfield and my other clients who had been contacted by my family's investigators. "Jonathan, I wanted to let you know that the people who contacted you about my business practices are actually family members who are upset about a personal matter," I explained, "and they're trying to damage my professional reputation as retaliation for a family conflict." "That's terrible, Veronica," he replied. "Is there anything I can do to help?" "Actually, yes," I said. "I'm going to be reaching out to several other business owners in the area to forming a professional alliance that could provide mutual support and referrals for members. Would you be interested in joining something like that?" By the end of that week, my family's comfortable world had begun to crumble in ways that made their lawsuit look like a minor inconvenience. Discovered that her friend Rachel was being forced to move out of her apartment building, and that the monthly allowance she had been receiving from an unknown source had suddenly stopped arriving. My mother's hair salon was closing down and she couldn't find another appointment slot anywhere in Willowbrook, because word had spread through the business community about the family conflict. Damon received a formal reprimand at work for involving Sterling Financial in personal legal matters and was informed that his conduct was being reviewed by the compliance department, and my parents realized that the supplemental income they had been receiving for years had disappeared, leaving them struggling to make their monthly expenses even with the reduced rent they were paying. The beauty of my response was that I hadn't done anything illegal or unethical. I had simply providing the quiet financial support and business advantages that my family had been enjoying without even realizing it. When Harold Whitmore called me 3 days later, his tone was very different from our previous conversation. "Miss Blackthorne, my clients would like to discuss the possibility of resolving this matter without further litigation," he said carefully. "I'm certainly open to reasonable discussions," I replied. but any resolution would need to include acknowledgement of the facts and a commitment to honest communication going forward. The war my family had started was about to end, but not in the way they had expected. The family meeting that finally ended this nightmare took place exactly 3 weeks after that fateful Christmas dinner in the same dining room where I had been called a burden, but this time, the power dynamics were so completely reversed that everyone seemed to be walking on eggshells around me. My parents sat at opposite ends of the mahogany table that I had purchased, looking smaller and more fragile than I had ever seen them, while my siblings and Aunt Delilah, they're alleging fraud and demanding financial disclosure related to a real estate transaction where I purchased property from family members to prevent foreclosure. I explained, but more importantly, they're seeking to have me removed as trustee, which suggests they may be planning to challenge the estate's management decisions. The board voted unanimously to suspend all distributions to the litigating family members, pending resolution of the legal matter, which meant that my parents' aunt, brother, and cousin would stop receiving their monthly checks within 30 days. Next, I activated the most powerful weapon in my arsenal by calling Thomas Sterling, the president of Sterling Financial Group, where my brother worked. "Tom, this is Veronica Blackthorne. We've done business together on several commercial lending deals," I said when he took my call. "Of course, Veronica, what can I do for you?" he replied warmly. "I wanted to give you a heads up that one of your employees, Damon Blackthorne, has filed a lawsuit against me, and some of the allegations involve business practices that could reflect poorly on Sterling's reputation if they become public." Tom's tone immediately became more serious. "What kind of allegations are we talking about?" "Claims of fraud, financial manipulation, and unethical business conduct," I explained, "all of which are baseless, but the litigation could generate negative publicity that mentions Sterling Financial since Damon has been discussing his employment there in connection with the case." I could hear him typing notes as I spoke. "I'm not asking you to take any specific action," I continued, "but I thought you should be aware that one of your employees is involved in a high-profile family dispute that could potentially impact the firm's reputation." The final piece of my response strategy involved reaching out to Jonathan Millfield and my other clients who had been contacted by my family's investigators. "Jonathan, I wanted to let you know that the people who contacted you about my business practices are actually family members who are upset about a personal matter," I explained, "and they're trying to damage my professional reputation as retaliation for a family conflict." "That's terrible, Veronica," he replied. "Is there anything I can do to help?" "Actually, yes," I said. "I'm going to be reaching out to several other business owners in the area to forming a professional alliance that could provide mutual support and referrals for members. Would you be interested in joining something like that?" By the end of that week, my family's comfortable world had begun to crumble in ways that made their lawsuit look like a minor inconvenience. Discovered that her friend Rachel was being forced to move out of her apartment building, and that the monthly allowance she had been receiving from an unknown source had suddenly stopped arriving. My mother's hair salon was closing down and she couldn't find another appointment slot anywhere in Willowbrook, because word had spread through the business community about the family conflict. Damon received a formal reprimand at work for involving Sterling Financial in personal legal matters and was informed that his conduct was being reviewed by the compliance department, and my parents realized that the supplemental income they had been receiving for years had disappeared, leaving them struggling to make their monthly expenses even with the reduced rent they were paying. The beauty of my response was that I hadn't done anything illegal or unethical. I had simply providing the quiet financial support and business advantages that my family had been enjoying, without even realizing it. When Harold Whitmore called me 3 days later, his tone was very different from our previous conversation. "Miss Blackthorne, my clients would like to discuss the possibility of resolving this matter without further litigation," he said carefully. "I'm certainly open to reasonable discussions," I replied, "but any resolution would need to include acknowledgement of the facts and a commitment to honest communication going forward. The war my family had started was about to end, but not in the way they had expected. The family meeting that finally ended this nightmare took place exactly 3 weeks after that fateful Christmas dinner in the same dining room where I had been called a burden, but this time, the power dynamics were so completely reversed that everyone seemed to be walking on eggshells around me. My parents sat at opposite ends of the mahogany table that I had purchased, looking smaller and more fragile than I had ever seen them, while my siblings and Aunt Delilah occupied the middle chairs with expressions that ranged from embarrassed to resentful to genuinely remorseful. The lawsuit had been formally withdrawn 2 days earlier, after Harold Whitmore explained to my family exactly how vulnerable their legal position had become once he discovered the full scope of my financial involvement in their daily lives. "Veronica," my father began, his voice hoarse with what might have been genuine humility for the first time in my adult memory, "we owe you an apology that goes far deeper than just being wrong about your financial situation." His words carried the weight of someone who had spent sleepless nights confronting uncomfortable truths about his own character and behavior. "We treated you terribly, not just at Christmas dinner but for years leading up to it, and the worst part is that we convinced ourselves we were being helpful when we were actually being cruel and dismissive." My mother nodded tearfully. "I keep thinking about all the times we offered you advice about getting your life together when you were already more successful than any of us could imagine. It makes me sick to realize how arrogant and blind we were." Brother Damon cleared his throat nervously before speaking. "The thing that bothers me most is that I offered you a data entry job when you were already running a business empire. I can't stop thinking about how condescending that must have felt." His shame was genuine, but it was also mixed with something that looked like fear because his experience at Sterling Financial over the past few weeks made it clear that his career prospects were now tied to my willingness to provide positive references. Penelope, who had been uncharacteristically quiet throughout the gathering, finally found her voice. "I've been thinking about why we were so wrong about everything, and I think it's because confused traditional markers of success with actual achievement. We saw your unconventional path and assumed it meant failure when it actually meant innovation." Her analysis was more thoughtful than I had expected, and suggested that she at least was capable of learning from this experience. Jasmine looked genuinely devastated as she spoke. "Veronica, I don't know how to apologize for participating in a lawsuit against you, especially after everything you've done for this family that we didn't even know about. The monthly allowance that was helping me get by came from you, didn't it?" Nodded, and she continued, "I've been living off your generosity while calling you a burden. It's probably the most shameful thing I've ever done." Aunt Delilah, who had been the most resistant to acknowledging any wrongdoing, finally spoke up, though her tone suggested that humility did not come naturally to her. "I still think you could have handled this situation differently by being more open about your success from the beginning, but I also recognize that we created an environment where you felt like you couldn't trust us with the truth." Her partial apology was probably the best I expect from someone who had spent decades perfecting the art of avoiding personal responsibility. "The question now," my father continued, "is whether there's any way to repair the damage we've done to our relationship with you, and whether you're willing to give us a chance to prove that we can be better family members going forward." The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of years of accumulated hurt and disappointment, but also with the possibility of something different, if we could all find the courage to be honest about what family support actually meant. "I want you all to understand something important," I said. Finally, "I didn't reveal my financial situation to prove that